Good morning, my dear students. Now we are going to see the chapter number 2, point number 2.2, Indian historiography, various ideological frameworks. And the point is colonial historiography. Colonial historiography, colonial means the British people who came to India and they settled in India, and then among them the scholars, the history writers, that is called the colonial historiography. What was their style of the historians of British? Now we are going to see. The early scholars who studied and wrote Indian history were mainly British officers and Christian missionaries. Their prejudice is clearly reflected in the way some of them have ridiculed Indian culture. Their writings were used to justify the colonial British rule. So the British came to India, they settled in India, and they ruled over India near about 150 years. But among them the historians were there, and they wrote the Indian history, and some of them were the Christian missionaries. So their prejudice is clearly reflected in the way of some of them have ridiculed Indian culture. So whatever they wrote about the Indian culture, about the Indian tradition, but they didn't go in deep. They have not written in detail about the Indian culture. Means some facts were there, some reality was there, but they rejected, they neglected, and their writings were used to justify the colonial British rule. Just means they focused only their colonial British rule. How are they? What was their rule and what was their tradition? Means in their writing, just they are given the justify only the colonial British rule. They neglected the Indian culture. The 5 volumes of the Cambridge History of India, published during 1922-1937 Christian era, are distinct examples of the colonial historiography. So, colonial historiography means the British officers who were there, those who were the scholars of historians, and some of them were there, the scholars and those who wrote about the Indian history, and one of them was the Cambridge History of India. That was the book, and it was published during 1922 to 1937. During this period, there was the rule of British, and so are distinct examples of the colonial historiography. This is the greatest examples of colonial historiography. Means even the British, those who were the historians, even then they wrote about the Indian history. Orientalist historiography. Now we are going to see the Orientalist historiography. Orientalist historiography means many European scholars felt curious about civilization and countries of the East. Some of those scholars felt admiration and respect for them, and these scholars were known as Orientalists. Orientalist historiography. Who is considered as a Orientalist means some of them the scholars, those who felt admiration and respect for them, and these scholars were known as Orientalists. Means some of them were the scholars felt curious about the civilizations and countries of the East, and they admired and they given the respect to for them, and these scholars were known as Orientalists. The Orientalists studied the similarities between the Sanskrit and some of the European languages. They focused more on Vedic tradition and Sanskrit literature. The Orientalists, the scholars, those who were the Orientalists, and they studied the similarities between Sanskrit and some of the European language. What is the difference between the European language and Sanskrit? They studied, they criticized, and they focused more on Vedic tradition and Sanskrit literature. But they focused on Sanskrit literature and Vedic tradition, because in our past tradition or past culture, Vedic tradition. Their studies resulted into formulating the nation of an ancient language that could be the mother of all Indo-European languages. Their studies resulted into formulating the notion of an ancient language that could be the mother of all Indo-European languages. And they studied about the Vedic language, about the culture, and they come to know about that language, that language, ancient language, could be the mother of all Indo-European languages. In 1784, Sir William Jones founded Asiatic Society in Kolkata, and it opened the doors for research in ancient Indian literature and history. Sir William Jones founded the Asiatic Society in Kolkata, and it opened the doors for research in ancient Indian literature and history. So the scholars, those who want to write about the Indian history, and so he founded the Asiatic Society for studying the scholars, those who want to write about the Indian history and for research and in ancient Indian literature and history. So they can come to this society and they can write about the ancient India and literature and ancient Indian history. Among the Orientalist scholars, French Max Muller deserves a special mention. In this opinion, Sanskrit was the most ancient language of the Indo-European languages. So, among the Orientalist scholars, one of them was the Friedrich Max Muller, and he deserves a special mention that in this opinion, Sanskrit was the most ancient language of the Indo-European language, and he focused that the Sanskrit language of Indian, it was the most ancient language of Indo-European language. He was deeply interested in Sanskrit literature and he studied it deeply, and so that's why he came to know that the Sanskrit language was the Orientalist language of Indo-European, and also he studied the Sanskrit literature. He first translated the Sanskrit text of Hitopadesh. He was the editor of 50 volumes of the sacred books of the East. So the Friedrich Max Muller, he wrote the book Hitopadesh, and he wrote this Hitopadesh in 50 volumes, in 50 parts, and that the sacred books of the East. He also compiled Rigveda, which has been published in 6 volumes. He translated Rigveda in German, and that's Muller, the Friedrich Max Muller. He also wrote the book Rigveda, which has been published in 6 volumes, means in 6 parts, and he translated Rigveda in German. Lately, Edward said, a scholar who has revisited the Orientalist writings has thrown light on imperialistic interest of the Orientalist scholars. So, Friedrich Max Muller, and another one is Edward. He said, a scholar who has reevaluated the Orientalist writings has thrown the light on the imperialistic interest of Orientalist scholars. Now, next point is that nationalistic historiography. Nationalistic historiography. Nationalistic historiography. The writings of the Indian historians who were trained in British educational system show in insulation to restore the pride in the ancient glory of India and the self-esteem of the Indian readers. The writings are known as a nationalistic historiography. So the national historiography, because they were Indians, but they got the education British educational system, under the British educational system, and that is why they show the insulation to restore the pride in the ancient glory of India. They were educated, and they were the Indians, and they wrote about the Indian culture, Indian tradition, Indian rituals, how we were the best of all, and that's why they wrote about the ancient glory of India and the self-esteem of the Indian readers. Their writings are known as nationalist historiography. Nationalist writings in Maharashtra were inspired by Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar. He criticized written by British officers. So one of the nationalistic historiography, that was the Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar, and he criticized the produced history of ancient India written by British officers. So the scholars, those who were the British and who had written about the Indian history, so Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar criticized what they wrote about the ancient India and about the Indian culture. He criticized and he took out some their minus points. The nationalistic historians try to seek the golden era of Indian history. They are at times blamed for ignoring the critical analysis of the historical truth. Mahadev Govind Ranade, Ramkrishna Gopal Bhandarkar, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, Rajendra Lal Mishra, Ramesh Chandra Mujumdar, Kasi Prasad Jaiswal, Radha Kumar Mukherjee, Bhagwan Lal Indraji, Vasudev Vishnu Mirashi, and Ananta Sadashiv Altekar are the names of the some renowned scholars among the nationalist historians. These were the historians, these were the scholars, those who write about the Indian history, about the ancient India, about the tradition, about the rituals, and these were the notable scholars, and these notable scholars were considered as a nationality historiography because they write about the only nation, they write about the only good things, and also maybe might have some bad things, but they focused on the nation, on the past India, the glory of India, and that is why these were the scholars who were considered as a nationalistic historians. Rajwade is well known for his writing in Marathi on various subjects like history, linguistics, etymology, grammar, etc. He was of the firm opinion that we should write our own history. Rajwade, he was well known for his writing in Marathi on various subjects, and like history, linguistics, etymology, grammar, these are the subjects he wrote, and he was of the firm opinion that we should write our own history. So what he formed, that he strongly desired that we should write about our only own history. He compiled and edited 22 volumes of मराठ्यांच्या इतिहासाची साधने. He wrote this book, and this book was published in 22 volumes, 22 parts. Rajwade, he wrote very scholarly prefaces to each of the 22 volumes. He stated history is the all-inclusive image of the past societies. It does not include only the stories of the political image, conspiracies and wars for seizing power. He insisted that history should be written only using the documentary source. So what he stated in his book, so he stated in his book that we should be write our own history, and he wrote the book Marathयांच्या इतिहासाची साधने, and he published this book in 22 volumes. And also he stated history is the all inclusive image of the past societies. Means if you write this book in the history, and so this is the image of the past societies. If we write about our nation, about our past culture, about our tradition, and so, and we can pass to the next generation. This does not include only the stories of political image. Means we should not include in our writing that only about the stories of political image, the conspiracies and wars for seizing power. So he insisted that history should be written only using the authentic documentary sources. The nationalistic historiography helped in the treating of the independence movement of the Indian people against the British. In this aspect, the book The Indian War of Independence 1857, written by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, is of a great importance. So Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, Swatantraveer, he was one of the greatest historians. He was one of the freedom fighters, and he wrote the book. The Indian War of Independence 1857, because on 1857 there was the national uprising. It was the biggest event in history, and on this event he wrote the book The Indian War of Independence 1857. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. The nationalistic historiography provided a momentum to the writing of the original histories too. As a result, the attention of the historians was drawn to the geographic conditions and history of South regions. And some of the historians, those who focused on the geographical conditions and history of South Indian origins. Next point is that historiography in the post-independence era. Post-independence era. After independence, now along with writing the dynastic history, the cultural, social, economic histories were also being written. Scholars of the past independence era began to feel the need of writing histories of various communities, science, economic, systemic, political ideologies, cultural aspects, etc. The historiography of this era has been influenced mainly by three ideological schools: Marxist history, subaltern history, and feminist history. And so let's stop here, and we will see about the Marxist history, subaltern history, and feminist history in the next video. And that is the end. So that is the end, and let us see about the next point in the next video. So thank you.